All right. Well, as folks keep piling in, I think I will get some of the house cleaning and stuff out of the way.
Okay.
I want to welcome everybody who's coming in and people who are still joining and thank them for attending our first workshop of the Whatcom Museum's Photography Month, Supercharging Your Snapshots. So we are here to discuss and learn a little bit about camera settings and how you can shoot your photos with intention. I'm Drew Watley, lead educator here at the Whatcom Museum, and I'm going to be acting as moderator for our program. Before we begin, we always like to start by acknowledging the land that the Whatcom Museum stands on. So the Whatcom Museum acknowledges that we gather on the traditional territory of the Laktamesh and Nuxalk people who have lived in the Coast Salish region from time immemorial. The museum honors our relationship with all of our Coast Salish neighbors and our shared responsibilities to their homeland where we all reside today. So we want to start with that. The other things that I'm going to be working on, I'm going to be handling stuff in the chat box. As Judy just commented that she can hear us, but she doesn't see her. So that's part of the webinar format. So the webinar format has the presenters and moderators up on screen. And then the attendees are kind of in the chat. And we can also bring you live to ask questions if that's necessary. But as part of that, what we would recommend is putting any kind of questions or whatnot into the chat, which then I'll be kind of going through, and both our presenters also have the ability to view, and we will bring up those questions kind of as they pop up or where they become relevant. But that's the deal with that. So the other thing to note is that the Whatcom Museum does record our webinars and repost them to our YouTube channel. So if you do miss out, or if you want to come back and refer to something again, you can look to the Whatcom Museum's YouTube channel, and we will get this program up there fairly shortly after we get done with it. So within a couple days. So as I mentioned, I'll be monitoring chat and QA. But now I want to introduce the two other fellows you see kind of in the boxes next to me. Doug Banner and Ham Hayes have between them decades of experience in education at all levels, serving in a wide variety of teaching roles. Doug combines his noteworthy experience as a storyteller, sculptor, and musician and educator with Ham's background in photography and technology to provide unique opportunities in self-discovery for their students. Most recently, they have been collaborating on an innovative visual arts curriculum, Imagine Myself, which helps Whatcom County school students discover and express their personal voice through the photographic arts. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our experts, Ham and Doug.
Thank you very much, Drew. We're happy to be here presenting some of the ideas and concepts around photography and storytelling using images that we have been teaching to middle schoolers and high schoolers over the last several years. So let me share my screen and then we'll go ahead with the presentation. And do feel free to include your questions in the chat as we go along. We'll take a few pauses as we go through each of the sections to look at some of those questions. So the question here, or the topic here, is supercharging your snapshots. And we're going to be specifically talking about the settings that the camera provides the photographer. And let's see if I can get my screen to move. I'll be in good shape.
Hey,
Okay.
right.
So for this class, the purpose is to familiarize you all with the camera functions and settings that will allow you to become more of an artist and less of a clicker. The thrust here is we're all familiar with automatic modes on digital technology. But what we do find is that sometimes the automatic mode is not giving us the results that we wish. And it really is, in fact, interfering with our intentionality. We may have an idea about what we want the image to look like, and what to include in it. And the automatic modes don't necessarily provide those opportunities. So we're working here with still images using digital imaging technology. We're not talking about video, which is a different modality. And we'll be covering a 3 or 4 basic settings in digital cameras and in a lot of smartphones that will allow you to take advantage of these settings and features. I will note that we're not going to talk about any specific technology. So, you know, I like Nikon, Doug likes Canon, other people like iPhones. There's lots of technology out there that is very useful, very fun to use, and can give you excellent results. So don't worry about that particular aspect of your choice of technology. There's a lot of personal preference involved in decisions in that area. So it's important to note that your camera sees differently than you do. A lot of you may already realize this, but some of us maybe need to be refreshed on that. So I'm just going to suggest you do a couple of little exercises here. So I want you to look at an object around the room or wherever you are. And I want you to close your eyes after you've looked at an object. And I want you to think about whether you can see in your mind's eye the exact reproduction of what you saw when your eyes were open. Now, there are probably a few folks out there that actually will have a very, very clear reproduction or image of what they saw with their eyes open. But probably the far majority of us will have more of a vague impression. We may be able to remember some of those features or not. The camera, on the other hand, records exactly what light got to the sensor, and that's fixed. Okay, that is stored in its memory, and there's no fuzziness about the image unless you intentionally are out of focus, of course. So another little exercise with your eyes open, think about whether you're seeing a sequence of still images or does it seem like you were watching a movie? Well, when our technology or cameras are in still image mode and not in the video mode, we can in fact take a sequence of images, and however the eye and the human brain actually integrate those, even though we do have what's called a frame rate. So in fact, if you go to the motion pictures, the movies, classic film movies are made up of 24 frames a second or thereabouts. So the movies are individual frames, but they're all blended by the brain as you see a sequence of those images. So again, the way the camera sees things in terms of sequences is different than our eye brain system. The last thing I want you to do is extend your arms to your sides until you can still see your hands. And so if you can still see your hands as you're looking straight ahead, that's called your, kind of your peripheral vision. Well, that's pretty wide. It's typically almost like 180 degrees, fully right and fully left. So we see a very, very wide field of view, although we may be in fact looking specifically at a subject like in the center of our vision field. We're still picking up information and seeing that. Now, in the case of cameras, that field of view is really determined by what we call the focal length of the lens. And more typical terminology would be a wide angle or a normal angle or a telephoto, or kind of the 3 generic categories. So a telephoto is we're really focused in on very, very small field that we're pointing at, whereas a wide angle, we get this very broad view. So the camera can emulate somewhat what we do with our eye brain system, but it has to go through some kind of settings to do that. You either have to change a lens or you have to move a zoom control of some kind in order to affect the change in the field of view. Oops, wrong way.
Wrong way, Mr. Ham.
Hey, there we go. All right. So intentionality, we even though we're going to be talking specific about camera settings, um, what we really want to point out is that there's a real integration or synergism between what we want our image to look like or say to us or say to other people, and how the camera settings actually affect the nature of that image. So when we're teaching our middle and high schoolers, we emphasize the fact that every image tells a story. Some people might say, well, it can tell a story, but it doesn't necessarily. Well, even those images that are not particularly good will have some kind of story behind them based upon the content and how it appears and so forth. But the real thing that we want to emphasize is that sometimes that story can be really told well and other times not so well. And that again depends upon us as the photographer in terms of what we do.
So
So,
I want to interject something here, Ham.
yeah, sure.
When you're doing your images and you're thinking, a lot of people don't think about the story at all. I've been researching storytelling and in cultures and society for the better part of 45 years now, and a lot of people don't even realize that they're doing story on a daily basis. And so one of the things we like in terms of intentionality is thinking about when you're taking an image, when you're creating an image, what's the story behind that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but it's embedded in our DNA, storytelling, and the photography is just another way of bringing story out, and maintaining the imagery and memory together. So just make that footnote. We'll move on.
Yeah, that's fine. And that's really a good point. And especially, we think of images, probably movies and videos tend to have more of a visible storyline to many of us because it represents a sequence of events or actions. Whereas it's sometimes harder for us to imagine that in a still image, but there's still, even though it's may not have motion per se or action, it still can be telling an awful lot about
Right.
of a story.
Thinking
And of
in
course, as an art form,
Right.
it's parallel with things like dance and music and fine arts and storytelling as well. So one of the things that, again, we emphasize relevance to the story being told is that when you are creating an image, you really don't want to include things in the image that are irrelevant or distracting from the story you want to tell. So that's a fundamental principle. And in later sessions, courses here on the Whatcom Museum program, you'll have more instruction on composition and framing, which will get into a lot more of the detailed techniques in that area. But we just like to emphasize the fact that if it's irrelevant in your image to the story you're trying to tell or story that's being presented to you, then it distracts from the quality, the perception, the understanding, the relationship you have with the image. So getting down to the nitty gritty, camera settings can improve the story or even potentially ruin it, depending upon what you do. I've ruined a lot of images in my lifetime, and I've also improved a lot of images through those experiences. So it's all a learning process. Don't hesitate to experiment, because that's the way you actually learn. It says, well, that one didn't really work the way I thought, and you might wind up surprising yourself. So manually setting your camera rather than in leaving it in automatic mode gives you maximum control of how your image looks. Automatic modes leave that control with someone else or even something else. If you think about algorithms and AI and all that kind of good stuff, you have to say some engineer someplace or whomever designed the algorithms that decided what settings to give your phone or your camera when you were pushing the button on the shutter. So if you want to be in more control, which a lot of artists are experimenting with, is what can they do to be creative? I don't want somebody else controlling my story. And it's just basically here, remind yourself that you are the artist, you're the storyteller. And so pay attention to what's important to you and have fun doing it.
Yeah, and also you can practice comparing your automatic setting to your manual setting. One of the things that we tell our students is don't throw anything away. A digital camera, you put a nice big 64 gigabyte disk in there. You can take 5,000 pictures, and you'll be sorry for that because you have to edit through them. But don't throw anything away because every single one of your images is going to teach you something about those settings. And if you take an automatic setting and compare it to your manual settings, you're likely to find that your manual settings are better because it's your eye making the determination, not somebody in China or Japan who set those cameras up for you.
Right on. So, those of us that have pursued this path of artistry, I only shoot in manual mode. It's just my habits now have all changed, and I don't really want to give up control. I'm really a control freak when it comes to that, as it were. All right, so seeing the settings. So this is just a couple of examples. On the left is a typical viewfinder. This is the one out of the entry-level Nikon camera. On the left side there, you see three numbers, 125. That represents 125th of a second. That's the shutter speed. And right next to that is f5.6. That's the aperture setting. And then there's a little scale, a 0 and plus and minus on either side of that with some hash marks. And that's a light meter, which helps guide the exposure level. And then there's a bunch of other information which we won't get into. The main idea is that if your camera or your phone are going to give you some technology, some displays that tell you where you are in terms of your settings, as well as obviously being able to see the subject in your viewfinder or after you've taken a picture, see the playback of the picture. Some of the cameras also have additional kinds of displays. Again, this is one of the Nikon 3400. And again, it shows you the shutter speed, 1/125th of a second, and f5.6 for aperture and an ISO of 100. We'll get into the details of these three areas in the next few slides here. But the point is that your technology will show you where you are so that you're not lost and hanging out there not knowing where you're going to go with this. All right. Okay, so we're going to look specifically at the impact of these settings. In automatic mode, you will wind up with one result. And in manual mode, you are going to be able to play. So we'll look at shutter speed, then we'll talk about focus and specifically aperture, and we'll talk about ISO or sensitivity. So shutter speed is simply how long the camera is actually accepting light from the subject. So I want to do another experiment. Shut your eyes, and with your eyes shut, blink them open and close as fast as you can. So a quick blink open and close. And how long did you think your eyes were open? So if any of you guessed that they were open a third of a second, that is the typical fastest blink speed of most of us humans. So when you think about that, that's, it's either not very long or it's a tremendously long period of time. But relatively, a third of a second is a pretty, pretty short time. It's not like you're continuously seeing. So that's why I say about the frame rate of the eye-brain system. But for a camera, 1/3 of a second is a long time, or we call them slow shutter or low shutter speeds. That's a long time. Typical camera shutter speeds range from very short or fast or high And in most of the entry-level digital cameras, they go up to about 1/4000th of a second. But that's 1,000 times faster than the blink of an eye. And on the other end of the scale, these cameras typically will be able to give you exposures of around 30 seconds, up to 30 seconds. They can actually be extended by other modes, but that if you're going to set one setting for a shutter speed, that's usually the last number you can select on the really long exposures. Now, one of the things we talk about in terms of exposure length is that when you get to the point where you're shooting at like a 30th of a second or thereabouts, which is 10 times shorter than that third of a second, more than often you really want to be on a tripod or have a stable base for your camera, because camera shake, you can hold it only so steady, and a fast shutter speed takes a lot of the camera shake away. So even though you may be looking at that bird flying by, the fact that you're using a fast shutter speed may obviate the fact that you're moving or your camera shaking or whatever. But when you're going for very long exposures, you'll be more often than not using a tripod or some kind of stability.
Stabilize it, yeah.
All right. When the subject and intended image is moving quickly, okay, so high speed, you're going to want in general to use a high shutter speed if you want to stop or freeze that action. So if they're taking pictures of automobiles, depending upon whether they're going sideways past you or coming towards you or moving away, you're going to pick a shutter speed that if you want to stop the action and freeze the motion, say you're at a race car or something like that, you will use a high shutter speed. For birds, typically birds in flight, you'll use a high shutter speed. Birds sitting on a branch, they're not doing much in the way of motion for the most part. So you might want to be using or can use a lower shutter speed. So we'll get into how high a shutter speed you need for some typical bird motion here in a moment. However, you can also, to say if something is moving quickly, you can also give an impression of motion by using a slower shutter speed, and then you'll see some of the image blurring, and that may give you a sense of motion in a still image. So those are how you're going to think about that. So this intentionality question enters in. So you're looking at your subject and you're saying, I'm trying to catch that bird in flight and I really want to see detail and so forth and so on. So you will intentionally select a high shutter speed. If on the other hand, you're going to be taking some other kinds of images where you want to blur things out, then you'll pick the other. And we'll see examples of that shortly. So the hummingbird is an interesting little critter. So the maximum beat speed, that is, the hummingbird is like lifting weights. Okay, they're constantly moving those shoulder muscles. So their wings are equivalent to arms, and they're moving their shoulder muscles, and they're going back and forth basically at the maximum of about 80 times a second. So what shutter speed do we think we might need to freeze that motion? Well, intuitively, you might just say, well, maybe like 1/80th of a second, because that shouldn't that stop the beat in mid-beat? And it probably is, but it's really only stopping the shoulder. And there's that whole extension of the wing going out there. And when you look at the velocity of the wing tip, it's a lot faster than 1/80th of a second is going to capture. So in fact, most of the time when you're taking birds and you want to freeze their action, you'll be tuning up around maybe no lower than 1,000th of a second, typically 2,000ths of a second or even higher. This particular image was shot at 1/6400th of a second. I wanted to make sure that I really did capture the wing beat as the wing position. And I also wanted to make sure I captured any detail. Any motion is going to wipe out fine detail in terms of your image. So these are the things you think about if you're like into bird or nature photography, is how fast is my subject moving and what effect do I want to have on that?
Yeah, to put it on the ground, Ham is the photographer, so he's been teaching me, and I've learned a ton in the last 2 years. But I wanted to I saw this image or one of Ham's images on the hummingbird, and we talked about all this. You think, oh, you just go out and set your shutter speed really fast and take a picture. Well, I'll tell you, 600 pictures later, I got a picture like that, And so on the ground, what you're saying right out the gate is that if you really want to be able to take some quality artistic pictures, you're going to want to practice. You want to go to take your camera out and shoot a whole bunch of stuff that you're not happy with, and play with those settings. And note that if you look at this picture on the lower right hand corner, you've got your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speeds are all right there. So that tells you that's your lesson plan. So if you've got a really good picture, you can remember what those settings are. But it really is an interaction between you and your camera, learning the tool, and understanding it to the point that you don't have to think about it anymore. I still have to think about what I want to do, because I don't have the years of experience that Ham does. But it really is practice, practice, practice. Take it away, Ham.
Very good points. Yep. I think I've in my library of around 10,000 images at this point, and I lost a few when I had a hard drive crash a number of years ago. So always back up your images.
Yeah.
All right, well, here's another one. Okay, so just a quick look at it, gang. Fast shutter speed or slow shutter speed on this image? And you can cheat and look down in the lower right-hand corner. Well, how could you tell maybe what the shutter speed is? First off, these are mergansers, and so they're they're a duck. They're a fairly large bird. You can see that their wingtips are pretty locked in. There's no fuzziness to the wingtip, which is where you would experience or expect to see some fuzziness if the shutter speed were too low to do a stop action here. But you can really tell by the water. So in order for these ducks to take off, they basically run across the water while they're getting up enough speed and wing beats to get some lift from their wing beats. It's just like an airplane taking off. You got to go fast enough on the ground to get that lift operating for you before you can break from the ground. So their run was 25, 30 yards or so across this pond. So you can see the water droplets in this image are just, I'll just expand it a little bit. You can see the water droplets are suspended in the air. So that really just tells you, yes, indeed, very fast shutter speed, because gravity is going to bring those water droplets down very, very quickly. And the answer again is I shot this at 1/6400th of a second. No, some cameras might not be able to get that high, but for the most part, if you're shooting at 2,000th of a second or more, you're going to get very, very good results in terms of stop action on birds. All right, here's another bird image. These are Hawaiian stilts. And they were the three of them were standing in this pond, and something spooked them. Not the photographer didn't spook them, because I was actually some distance away. This is a telephoto shot. But they did get spooked. I think maybe one of them looks a little angry at the other. But what you see on the wingtips is that there's blurring going on the wingtips. All right. So what this tends to do for you in terms of an impression is, again, it gives a sense of motion on top of the fact that there's obviously some direction that one bird is trying to fly and another bird is trying to fly in the other direction. But that blur in the wingtip is a really good technique, again, we talked about earlier, for conveying a sense of some kind of speed or motion going on. Now, the interesting thing about this is I was saying, okay, well, what's a high shutter speed? What's a low shutter speed? Well, this shutter speed was actually fairly high. It's not up over a thousandth of a second, but it's 1/400th of a second. And that gives you a sense, even though these are a large bird, they're about the size of a heron, a small heron. Not a great blue, but like a night heron or something like that. But the wingtip velocity is extremely high on these birds. So that just gives you a sense of where you might want to be if you're thinking about, again, the capture of a bird in flight. It might be taking off off a tree branch, or if you're down taking pictures of raptors around in the Sandwich Flats, down around Bow and Edison. If your shutter speed is in this kind of mid-range, you might see that blurring wingtip on that. Of course, if you shoot even slower, you might see the whole bird blurred in your image. Again, you want to experiment with different speeds under different situations so you get that kind of experience. All right, different subject. So let's look at these two waterfalls. Again, long or short in terms of shutter speed. Well, again, you can cheat and look at the answer. So the waterfall on the left, which is up in Jasper National Park in Canada, that was a half a second exposure. You can go down to Whatcom Falls and take a picture from the bridge there looking at Whatcom Falls and try different shutter speeds, obviously balancing your ISO and your aperture to compensate for the exposure level, which we'll talk about. But try different shutter speeds. Go from several seconds to a 400th or 500th or even a thousandth of a second, and see what the effects are. If this were taken at a thousandth of a second, I would see more like what I saw on the Merganser Pond, which is water droplets and spray and things of that nature, rather than this smoothing function. So by this long exposure, if you think about a drop of water, it's flowing from the top and then it's flowing over these little waterfalls. And so all of the time that that individual water drop is flowing, the light is being reflected off of it. So it's contributing to the exposure. And so, of course, when you have enough of these water droplets, they blend all together in these smooth functions. These are really fun pictures to take because we don't see this with our human eye and brain. Everything else in this image is tack sharp, okay, permanently fixed and not in motion at all. And yet this water has got this diaphanous kind of magical quality to it, or mystical quality to it. Oh, mystical, that's a pun, isn't it? Oh, bad. Gosh, I live in shame.
Yeah, that's one for you.
Yeah. Now, the waterfall on the other side, again, intentionality, okay? So the waterfall on the other side is up in Iceland. Now, this one was shot with a very long telephoto lens. And the waterfall, Giangi, is like absolutely immense. This is only a fraction of the mass of water that's flowing over this. But what I wanted in the image is I saw these individuals, they were probably photographers who were standing way too close. But anyway, they were standing there and I wanted to make sure that I got them so that they weren't blurred. I wanted them in the picture, okay, to give a sense of scale. This is an immense waterfall. How best to compare something that's that immense with our human, which is basically our measuring stick, right? If you just cover your hand over the bottom of that image, you can't tell whether that is just a picture I took in the shower or a picture that I took from a half a mile away at a gigantic waterfall. But with those humans in there. So I wanted to capture them. I wanted them still. So I picked a shutter speed that was intermediate between, I wanted smoothing in the water. I did not want it to be just a bunch of individual dots. So I picked 1/640th of a second. for that image there. So I compromised. I didn't get the true stop action on the water, but I didn't want that. But I couldn't really take it for that really long exposure because I was afraid that I would lose the detail in the humans. So again, that's the intentionality in terms of creating your image.
And
But
this
it
is
shows you what you can do in terms of long and short shutter speeds with regard to flow and how that appears. Doug?
and that's part of the storytelling component when you're putting your images together. So on on the left is much more ethereal. There may be a sense or an emotion that you were looking for, or you're wanting to portray in your story. So you're going to choose to slow that down and make it much softer. You're looking for an emotional tone, and then the emotional tones of both are different. On the other side, there was some real intentionality about showing scale. That's part of the story. And that's why I say an image is telling part of a story. And then Ham has, as a photographer, he's got all the images before this spot and all the images after this spot. But this is part of this continuous sequence of storytelling and the decisions made about, in this case, water as the theme.
Right. And that's a good point too, that we can see a story in a single image, but we can also create a story out of individual images that are related in some way.
There's the
So it's
question
not
here.
quite a movie, but it is a series of or sequences or related topics. One of my favorite exhibitions goes back a long time, The Family of Man. And it was just images of people, and there were hundreds of images from all different parts of the world, and just an absolutely amazing story without having any action in it. Okay, it was all relational. We'll get to that some more as well.
So you have a question about on the softer waterfall on the left, you were using a tripod, yeah?
Yes, I was using a tripod on that. Half a second is long enough that you want to use a tripod. I wanted to make sure I got the detail out of the rocks. So I'm with my bird photography, I'm handheld, even with the telephoto lens. And that's because I'm shooting at such high shutter speeds for the most part that I don't have to worry about camera motion. But when I'm doing landscape photography, I'm almost always using a tripod. Well, this is the final image on shutter speed. And this is, some of you may recognize this. These are the moai from Easter Island. So the interesting thing about this image is it was taken at 3 a.m. In the morning. It was a moonlit night, and you can see up the upper portion of the image where there's a kind of a brightish area. And that was the moon was located slightly out of the image. I didn't include the moon itself. And we were light painting. So there were several of us, we had flashlights. And so we were just shining the flashlights back and forth on the moai to illuminate them. So a special effects kind of image, which I don't think you can get in automatic mode, because you had to be on a moonlit night with weird objects, these monuments, these statues, ancestral statues, with flashlights, a camera on a tripod, and with the intention that you were going to try to shoot for some interesting and different effect. So the shutter speed here is 19 or almost 20 seconds. So again, obviously a tripod. There'll be some other things we can talk about this and notice, but you can have fun, get out there and night and shoot some images. If you're in an urban environment, the street lights, reflections off of water, especially at night, vehicles moving. If you had people walking around in front of this image, they would not show. Okay, because at 19 seconds, they're going to be at most a ghost. You can actually do ghost pictures by picking a shutter speed. So say you're in an area where there's foot traffic, people traffic, set your shutter speed at 10 seconds or 5 seconds or something like that. And so all of the fixed objects, of course, will show up, okay? And they'll be in focus and sharp and so forth. But those people moving around maybe you'll see a blur. So you can have some pretend ghost pictures if you want. So next we're going to talk about
I have another
you got
question.
some questions? Yeah.
Yeah, we have another question on that. So what she's asking is, so there was never a light focused on all of these at the same time. You were moving the light back and forth during that 20-second period.
That's correct. You have to focus in the dark, basically. So before we actually took the image, what we would do is shine a light on one of the moai so we could focus the camera. And we were using manual focus also, not autofocus. Again, I use manual focus, and but that's it for a more advanced discussion on how to combine both manual and automatic focusing. It can be done in a lot of cameras. But yes, what we did was we were just waving the lights back and forth. There were about 4 or 5 of us that each had a torch or a flashlight, and it was just flashing it around on the subjects. Any other questions on?
No, that's what we got.
That's what we got. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about focus, aperture, and depth of field. So I just said most cameras are set up for autofocus. When you start to press the shutter button down, the camera will automatically focus. And there's all sorts of settings that you can make in terms of what the camera is going to focus on in terms of the area of the screen, of the viewfinder. And we won't get into that particular topic right now. It's for a future class. So, but in general, you'll want the most important part of the image, that which you're really trying to show off, to be in focus. I use spot focusing, so I always focus on the object that is my principal interest, no matter what the other conditions are. Of course, unless I want to blur my primary subject, but I have done accidentally.
Yeah.
So depending on your intention, some of your image may have objects close to you and some of them may be far away. Landscapes are typically in this category. In other cases, you may want some of the image in focus and the rest blurred or out of focus, because the background, like if I'm taking bird pictures, I typically will want to blur the background because the details can be very distracting to your principal subject. And I'll show you some examples here as we go through some of the rest of the pictures here. But anyway, that range from where you're near, the closest to you, to the furthest away is called the depth of field. Okay, so that's kind of the range from close to you to far away from you that will be in focus at whatever camera setting you have. And depth of field does vary. It depends upon the camera's aperture setting and how open or closed it is. It depends upon the focal length of the lens you're using, whether you're using a telephoto or normal or a wide angle. It also depends upon how close you are to the subject. And we'll see some examples of that in the upcoming pictures.
And if I could, one of the common mistakes of the automatic setting, especially I've been to Africa on safari a couple of times, and you get focused on your subject, and so you focus your camera on the subject, which might be an elephant or gazelle or something. And if you have it on automatic, what can happen is you may not see that twig going across your viewfinder because you're so intent on your elephant or whatever it is. When you take the picture, what you got is a beautiful picture of a twig, because the automatic setting isn't going to compensate for that. Whereas if you take a manual setting with your aperture, you can eliminate the twig and see what you want, which is the elephant. And so
yeah,
this one here is a really important one to understand, especially if you're trying to get certain kinds of pictures when there's a lot of stuff going around and you want to focus and get a clear image of something.
Right. Yeah, and you don't need an elephant either. If you're taking bird pictures here in the Pacific Northwest, and that bird is sitting amongst some branches, your autofocus might tend to pick up the branches that are closest to you, and the bird is a little further back and it will be out of focus. I have enough images like that myself earlier on until I switched to manual focus mode. And then when I got into manual focus mode, when I focused on the bird, as long as that bird was there and I was standing where I was, I didn't have to worry about focus anymore because that was in fact the right setting. Obviously, if the bird moves or you move, then you've got to refocus, but you have to do that in any case. So that's a very, very important point to really make the quality of your snapshots really effective if you have things that are in the way or in between. And you have to be very careful what the camera decides to focus on. And those other settings, whether you're using a matrix focus, which combines a lot of points in your viewfinder, or you're using a spot focus, that makes a big difference. So that's things for you to experiment with and learn from. All right, the camera's aperture is like the pupil of your eye. When the light is really bright, your eye will shut down. You'll have a little pinpoint of an opening in your pupil. If the light level is pretty low, you'll watch your pupil, open up very widely. In the case of a camera, though, we're setting that pupil opening. So what it does, among other things, is it controls the amount of light that's coming in and out. We'll talk more about that in exposure. But the other effect is that aperture opening is a major control of depth of field. So if I have my aperture wide open, like the really enlarged pupil, that's going to give me narrower or shallower depth of field. And that means that the range from near to far is going to be a lot smaller than if my pupil or my aperture is set to being very small, in which case I'll have a very large or deep depth of field. So that's important to know that, but it's also important to realize that there are other factors that affect depth of field, including the focal length of the lens, as I mentioned, whether it's telephoto, normal or wide angle, and the distance to the subject. And we'll see some examples. Okay, going back to our display, we can see here's the F5.6. It's an F number. It's counterintuitive because it's kind of upside down to a lot of people. When you think of F2.8 as having a shallow depth of field, you can think of, okay, small F numbers mean smaller depth of field. Large F numbers mean larger depth of field. But when you think about the amount of light coming in, it's kind of counterintuitive. F22 lets a lot less light in than F2.8. And anyway, and there's a complicated mathematical formula for how you calculate F numbers, and we won't worry about that unless you want to take the graduate course, and we can get into it at that point. Okay, just to remind you, wide angle, wide aperture, wide open, shallow or narrow depth of field in general, small aperture, large depth of field in general. All right, let's take a look at some examples. All right, so your quick impression of this image. Is this a large depth of field or a small depth of field? Any volunteers? Okay. Well, we can tell from the image because we have objects that are really close to the camera. Okay, these branches and twigs, the grass and everything like that. And that's all tack sharp in terms of focus. And then as we look back in about a quarter of a mile away, and look at that image there, we can see that the tree trunks, I can see branches, probably can't see the individual leaves because they're pretty small on the larches, but you can certainly see that there's that's in focus back there as well. So this is of large depth of field, okay? And if we look down at the setting, you can see that the F number was F22. Now, also note that the picture shutter speed was 1.3, little over 1 second. So obviously Ham was on a tripod, okay, or the camera was. Ham wasn't, the camera was.
I want to see that.
Yeah, all right. It's happened. Okay, here's another one. Shallow depth of field or large depth of field?
See, you
Smaller
never
line.
know this was actually a watercolor, right? Sorry.
Okay, so the truth of the matter here is that these swans, this was up in Haines, Alaska. These swans, you can see they're tack sharp. Okay, all the detail on the swans. You can even see feather patterns. They were quite a distance away. This was taken with a telephoto lens. But look at the background. This is a mountain range behind Glacier National Park up there in Alaska. And you can see the outline in the bottom of the image of the forest, the trees in the forest. And you see they're out of focus. Okay, they're blurred. So this, in fact, is a shallow depth of focus. You see it's f6.0, 6.0. Whoopsie daisy, Ham. And so the depth of field with especially with a long telephoto can be just on the order of a few inches, even at this great distance. So you really want to be very careful. I would not, if I had opened that up to like an f3.5, I may have actually missed some of the wingtips being in focus, especially since the birds were kind of staggered also. They weren't like straight vertically on top of each other. The male was further away. So again, you have to be thoughtful about it. And when you're thinking of depth of field for a particular subject area, one of the things to do is say, well, I'm just going to set my aperture for something that's going to be close. And then I will only worry about changing my shutter speed or my ISO to get the exposure right. So this one was constrained, however, because I had an aperture of 6.0, 6.0, and I had a shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second. And we'll talk about exposure in a moment and the third variable. Okay, a couple more examples. All right, on the left, this is a Chinese garden down in Portland. Interior scene here on the left. Shallow depth of field or large? Okay. Well, it sure looks like a shallow one because the wood frame here, the lattice work is clearly in focus, and yet the background through the window is clearly not in focus. So you'd say this is in fact a shallow depth of field. However, if I look at my F number, I see F16. Now, F16 normally is going to give me a pretty large depth of field. But in this case, I was shooting, even though I was close up, I was shooting with the telephoto, a medium telephoto lens, but I was just inches away from the subject. Okay, it was what's called a macro lens, and I was inches away from the subject. So those two other factors that I talked about, how close you are to the subject and the focal length of your lens, also had a big effect on the depth of field. But I got the effect that I wanted. I did not want the background overpowering the texture and the shapes of the image. On the image on the right, also at the Chinese garden, but taking a look at one of the roof lines of the building, and then in the background, the skyscraper, which was some blocks away. Again, same telephoto lens, and you can see I had a f-stop of f8. Okay, so you say, well, why were those now? I mean, it looks upside down. The f16 here and the f8 there. Well, the reason is that I was quite a ways behind the building and the roof line. So both of them, where I focused, I think I may have in fact focused on the tree behind there to sort of compromise, having the building and the roof line both in focus. So this is where you get into having to kind of pay attention to what your intention is and what your camera position is with regard to the subject, how far away you are. And so when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can usually preview the depth of focus certainly on the cameras that we use. You can preview the depth of focus. So you can push a little button before you take the picture and you can see how it came out. Or since this is digital photography and it doesn't cost you anything to take an extra picture, take a trial picture, take 2 trial pictures, try different settings until you find the ones you like. So, but again, this would be called a largish depth of field, okay, in that particular case. All right, let's see what else we got here. Oops, I'm gonna.
Get your
There we go.
mail.
Okay. All right, large or small? Okay, so the bird flying down, this is down in Florida. So you can see the birds in sharp focus, the background, trees and so forth, and the water not, there's no shoreline. There's actually a shoreline, and although it's hard to see the patterns, they were repeating. There's a pattern going this way, and there's a pattern going that way in terms of the reflection of the vegetation. So the shoreline was going through about here, something like that. And again, I kept all that out of focus by using a shallow depth of field, f5.6. Not too far down the road from there, sunset. In this case, we see grasses in the marshland just in front of us. And we also see tree line along the horizon. These trees a great distance away. And we see f16 again for our aperture setting. So Aperture's got a little more complexity to it than shutter speed. Shutter speed is kind of like just one variable you have to take into account. Depth of field has 3 variables that contribute: the aperture opening, the closeness to the subject, and the focal length of the lens.
Yeah, so when we're teaching aperture with the kids, what we do is we take objects. What we use is billiard balls, because that's what I have, and we line them up away from us and just have them practice using that aperture opening. So your exercise is focus the first ball closest to you and the other's out of focus, and then practice focusing down that line. And you don't need billiard balls. You can use any objects, but in a kind of a line away from you, and just practice with that aperture opening and see what you get, because you've got a consistent subject that you're looking at. Once you set your shutter speed and your ISO, the only variable you'll have there will be the aperture. So you really get a sense of how that aperture opening can work, and then you can go outside and play with it. But that's been a pretty effective exercise in our teaching.
Yep.
And one you could set up in your living room table or your dining room table.
Or just get a long ruler or a yardstick and lay it down lengthwise on the table. You can do that too and play around with it.
Or if you're
Just to get a feel.
Yeah, if you got a family, have people stand up and take pictures that way too.
Yeah.
Get everybody involved.
Okay, well, all of this comes together in what we call exposure, all right? Because, you want your picture to be not too light and not too dark, okay? And if it is too light or too dark, then you have to make adjustments, unless that's what you want, of course, as an artist. So the questions you ask yourself is there still detail? If I'm looking for kind of an optimal exposure, can I still see detail in the highlights and or the shadows? Okay. And of course we can control the exposure level. Now the shutter speed lets light in for a certain period of time. The aperture opening lets kind of quantities of light, depending on smaller quantities if it's top down or small, and larger quantities of light if it's wide open. And so that combination of time and aperture opening give us a glom of light. I like to think it was kind of a glom of light that comes together on the sensor. Now it used to be film, but now it's digital sensors. So the digital sensors are what are going to capture the photons, the light, and and process that and record it in your memory card. But we can control that sensor because it's an electronic device, and so we can control it like the volume control on a radio, the amplitude or volume of it, or magnitude of this, what we call the sensitivity of the sensor. So we can make that sensor very, very sensitive. And you notice that I shot some of those images at very high ISOs, like 3200. I also shot some of my images at a very low ISO, like 100. But that's our third variable we control. So once we picked the aperture and once we picked the shutter speed, if we want both of those to be a specific value based upon our experience and our intention, then the only third variable we have is varying the camera sensor sensitivity. All right, so that number 100 to whatever it is a standardized number. It's an international standard called ISO. 100 is a low sensitivity. That's and 6400 or higher is a high sensitivity. Now, the thing is that classically or traditionally, digital sensors a few years ago, you really wanted to shoot as low an ISO as you possibly could because there was less noise. It's like little color specks and things like that in the pixels that show up when the amplitude or is cranked up on the sensitivity. The most recently, the sensors have so improved in digital camera technology in iPhone or other digital phone technologies that you're even at a very relatively high ISOs like 6400. There's a relatively low noise, so you can get very, very acceptable images in low noise conditions. Again, more discussion in an advanced course, but just keep that in mind. But you'll see that I have shot my images anywhere. I typically would have no problem at all shooting at 6400 with my camera. It will vary with yours, of course. All right, so let's take a look at. So now, how do you tell where your exposure is? Because you've set your shutter, you've set your aperture, you're looking at your image. Well, in your viewfinder, you saw that light meter, okay? So this is just an expansion of the light meter. And this typically, the way these light meters are set up with a nominal 0. So if you don't see bars going off to the left or off to the right, you will be probably at a nominal exposure. Typically, these settings may be, this might be a full twice the amount of light or half the amount of light, depending upon other settings in your camera. We won't worry about that. The point is that you can make a judgment and adjust your ISO manually by using your light meters. I'm looking at it. I've got my other two settings fixed. Now I can use my hand on my camera where I can set the ISO, and there's techniques for each of these cameras for doing that, or iPhones. And I can adjust my exposure so it's in a nominal range in case I don't want it overexposed or I don't want it underexposed. All right. Sometimes I do want to have exposures overexposed or underexposed. That's an artistic choice, isn't it? One of the things we teach the kids is not to be judgmental about their images. Experiment, find out what you like and what you don't like. You may find that you have developed a whole new modality for photography that nobody else has. And it'd be quite exciting. All right, so anyway, these are interactive. All three of these settings play together in terms of the exposure. So let's see what some of this might look like. Now, this is just a repeat. If you're underexposed, your shadows are going to lose detail. So if the detail in the shadows is important, you have to take that into consideration, what you might do. You might pick locating yourself in a different direction in terms of lighting in order to balance off some of the contrast between the high, well lit areas and darkly lit areas. Okay, highlights, you lose detail. That's the people use the term blown highlights, and that's where there's just absolutely no detail. It is white, white, white. And gee, you thought you got the picture of that cloud, but the cloud was a white cloud. It got overexposed, and it just looks like a cartoon. Whatever. Okay, so let's look at some of the exposure effects here. So a bee on a flower. So the middle one is the optimal exposure. And you see, if I was overexposed, if I basically was letting in too much light, or I had my sensitivity cranked too high, okay, I would get these blown out highlights. That flower has virtually disappeared, except as the cartoon outline. And some of the other detail that I wanted on the bee is also wiped out, okay? There would be, let's just see if we can, for instance, we were seeing detail in along the thorax and along the body here, and we've lost a lot of that detail of that furry body. We've lost a lot of highlights and detail over here. The yellow flower is gone. Okay, it's non-existent also, except as a yellow blob. So clearly that's too far for my taste anyway. If we look at the underexposed section, again, now we see that in the dark areas, we've lost detail there. There's all that little fine structure is not showing up in that. So that's again, you want to play with it. This is the third variable to play with. Generally not the first variable. I usually pick aperture first because I want to set up where I want to be with depth of field, depending upon the subject. It's landscape or birds or whatever. So I pick my depth of field. So I'll set my aperture. Then I decide what my shutter speed should be, depending upon whether the subject's in motion or not. And then I will, once I've set that, then I will measure with the light meter and set my ISO to match up the proper exposure.
Shall we share the little trick we discovered with the students?
I'm sorry?
Shall we share the little trick we discovered with the students with the automatic ISO?
Sure.
So this particular, the ISO setting can be flummoxing if you're trying to do three things at one time. Three new things at one time. I spent 40 years as a teacher, so three new things at one time can be overwhelming. And the other thing is that some people say, oh, if it's overexposed, I can fix it in post-production. Well, you can, depending on the quality of your film editing. The better thing to do is try to take a better picture. So if you're new to the photography and all of these settings are challenging for you, which is the case with many of our students, if a student is struggling with three settings, there are ways on both the Nikon and the Canon that you can set the ISO to automatic, and then you can practice with your shutter speed and your aperture openings. And once you get comfortable with those two things, then you put your ISO on manual as well. So if you're overwhelmed by too many things, just put your ISO on automatic for a little bit, practice the other two, and then once you've mastered those, come back to the manual ISO. Let's see, for the Connor, we got a question here, Ham, for the Connor Weekly News. My editor needs lighter exposure photos and more white subjects. Like I took a photo with a white canoe on the Snohomish Channel, and he could use it. Tips for news print photos. I think that might be something coming up in one of the other classes. Is that correct?
Yeah, in terms of exposure, sometimes depending upon whether the image is going to be displayed digitally, like on a monitor, or it's going to be in print, the nominal exposure setting might be different. I find that when I am printing, I will actually have a different setting depending upon the subject and the colors and so forth and so on. So again, that is more sophisticated in terms of this course, this level course. But it is something, again, to experiment with. So if you are in fact doing print-based photography, you're going to want to study those effects and see what happens. You'll notice, to go back to the image, whoops, daisy. Go back to this image. When we talk about blown highlights, you cannot adjust that image and bring back the highlights. Okay, so if you gave your editor a picture with blown out highlights with no detail, they might say, well, that's okay because that's just a small part of the subject area or the image. But if it was the primary part of the image, like you're a wedding photographer and you're doing prints for the family, they're going to want to see the lace and all that kind of good stuff. You could easily blow out the highlights on a wedding dress because it's all, maybe all white or whatever. So these are the kinds of things, again, you need to set what your intention is and then also experiment, play around, take lots of test images, do it in enough time so that when you get out into the field, you have to think less about that. And you also are pre-armed with what your intention is and where you would possibly go. All right. Somebody's always wanting to know about the automatic presets in digital cameras and phones. And they do have these features. The question is, are they useful? Well, like any regular auto mode, okay, these other presets, you might have a scene mode, a night mode, a backlight mode, a portrait mode, a moving lights mode. There's all sorts of modes that the engineers have come up with to include in these cameras. And it not only is just the settings, by the way, of aperture and shutter speed and ISO, but they also can put in some algorithmic processing of the image based on that. They might change the contrast ratio. They might supersaturate the colors. There's all of this kind of stuff that goes on in what we call post-processing that can go on in camera as well. My whole point is that somebody else is doing that for you. And so if you like what the modes are giving you, it certainly saves you time. But I would argue that maybe you won't feel nearly as creative about what you're doing. And maybe it'll be more fun or less fun. It all depends upon what your particular attitudes and preferences are. As an artist, I would use any mode possible to express my creativity. So if I go out and I'm trying to do some painting, which I do occasionally, not much, because I'm a better photographer than I am a painter. But when I try to do that, I say, okay, well, let me see what effects I can produce here with a different medium. Or I may pick up a different kind of camera and say, what kind of effects can I produce with this different kind of camera? Maybe I will choose to shoot all my images in black and white, which is effectively using a different kind of camera. All right, because now you have to pay attention to tonal range rather than the colors. Most of our images these days, we're all concentrating on the color and not the detail, the fine detail. So those are things that you will wind up potentially experimenting with, which automatic mode will never fully give you that capability. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. I got to keep our watch on our time here.
Yeah, we're getting.
Okay, so Doug, you want to talk a little bit about how these settings might further affect story?
Yeah. So oftentimes when we're taking story, say on vacation is a common one. A lot of folks, not just me saying this, but professionals that I've talked to, say people take pictures on vacation to kind of prove that they were there, and not really thinking about the story behind it. And part of the, as I said right off the bat, when we're creating these images, we kind of want to have a story in mind of what we're doing. So why are we taking the images is a good way to start. Why am I taking these pictures? Now, there are certain elements in a story that also apply to the image that we create, and one of those things is there's a story that catches people has some kind of an emotional tie. So a story, an oral story, number one is a relationship between the storyteller and the audience. Well, an image is the same thing. When you're creating an image for consumption to share, you're developing a bridge for a relationship. So what is the relationship of what your image to the people that you're going to share with? You know, so if you're trying to capture a vacation, are you just capturing where you went, or are you capturing the story of your adventure on this vacation? That's going to change how you take pictures. You're not going to take 50 pictures of somebody down in the right or left hand corner just to prove you were at Tetons or prove you're at Grand Canyon, unless, of course, as Ham did, that picture, the person in that picture is intended to be there for a reason. You know, so if that person is in there and intended to be there for a reason, then what you do with your camera settings and how sharp that person's image in that person in that image is a part of the story. I mean, that's you're thinking not just about an image, but what's the impact of the image. Another element of image making and storytelling is sequencing. You know, when you're taking a series of images, are these images going to be intended to stand alone, like many images oftentimes are, say for consumption for sale or something like that? Or are these images meant to be in a sequence to tell a story? And even if an image is by itself as a standalone, there's still a story like that. How many times have we seen images of the craggy-faced old people with the babushkas on, you know, or the beautiful faces of children? Those images tell a story, and those images are powerful. If you ever look at the promotions for like Save the Children or promotions for ASPCA or any of those, people choose images that have a strong emotional impact. They don't have to be negative. They can be fun. They can be lively. So that's part of it, is that the intention that we go into our image making with really affects the quality of our images and the choices that we make in the settings. We want to take control of the variables, and that's another element of the story. When I am performing on stage, I might tell the same story to 3 different audiences. And those 3 different audiences, say a group of elders, a family grouping, and a group of kids, I'm going to choose to put different amounts of detail in those different stories, so that the elders will have a lot of imagery already in their head. So I may not have to paint so much of a word picture for them as I would say for a family of diverse experiences or a bunch of kids that have not as many images in their head. For instance, if I tell stories of growing up on a farm in Tennessee to a bunch of city kids who don't even know the difference between a carrot and a rutabaga, I have to add a lot more detail. So when you're taking pictures, when you're creating images to tell a story, how much detail has to be in that image? Where does your depth of field want to follow? Do you want the subject to stand out, or do you want the subjects to be a part of the whole story? And these are the kinds of things that one considers as you're creating your images in kind of a story format. Why am I taking these pictures? What's the purpose? How am I going to use them? And what will be the story behind them? And as I said, every image has a series of images before it and a series of images after it, and all those make up the story. So are you just simply trying to capture a moment in time? One of the things that one of the students pointed out when he was taking pictures of Whatcom Creek was that once he took that picture, that was the only time forever that that picture would ever be taken because the water's already gone. And so that's a part of the story. And we created a whole story around that one image of that water's gone and it's never going to be the same again. So even a single image can have very powerful emotional resonance. We had a young woman who the theme was, how do I fit in nature? How does nature live in me? And she took a series of signs, street signs, and she put this whole thing together. And her story of the street signs was how those street signs represented the way she lived in the natural world. And the street signs were part of her natural world. Again, maybe it's because kids are unbridled with their imagination, but when they're given a theme, when they're given an idea of take pictures that feed this story, they're bold. They take risks, and so that's the kind of the final element of it as we run close to our time, and I want to give you time for questions. Is the only person who's going to see the pictures on your camera? It will be you. So take risks. Nobody's going to know. And if there's an image that has a mistake in it, the only person who knows it's a mistake is you. Common thing with storytellers is when we're telling a story, we might forget a detail that belonged in the beginning, and we forgot the detail. So to put it in the middle, the only person who knows that is the storyteller. So when you're creating images and you're being artistic with your work, and you're thinking in terms of story, be bold, take risks, and really see what you can develop. So we've got some time.
We got a couple more images and then we'll be done.
Yeah, and we'll give you some opportunity to ask us some questions.
Yeah. Okay. The final words, you've actually articulated them very well. Okay. So what's the question? What do I want the image to say? And think about what to include in the image and what to exclude. That goes back to the distraction stuff. And the final image is of a Mississippi kite. Again, shallow depth of field and very high shutter speed. So a combination for this. And over to the questions, Drew. Anything else?
I will say that the one that popped up in the chat that we didn't really get around too much, kind of way earlier, there was a question about camera cleaning. And if y'all have any recommendations for places, someone's having issues with camera showing spots on sky pics. So lens cleaning, that kind of thing. Is there any recommendations of products or places to go?
Yeah, the spots that show up in your images look like little disc or whatever, especially in the sky, are probably a dirty sensor. Okay, it's not the lens that's dirty, but the sensor, which is where the image plane is. There are some professional cleaning services. I'm not familiar with the ones that might be in the Bellingham area. Kenmore Camera, it might be a good contact, at least to get in touch with them. They're down in Kenmore in the Seattle area.
Quicksilver is a possibility.
You might check with Quicksilver, also here locally in Bellingham.
They're on Cornwall.
Yeah, what our cameras have built-in sensor cleaners, so that gets rid of most of that stuff. But when I do finally get to the point where I need to send it away, I will actually send it to professional service in California or wherever. The other thing is, of course, in editing the images, you can take out those spots, but that's an advanced course topic. But anyway, I would try that. Call up Quicksilver, talk to Al Sanders, maybe. I think Al's still there.
A number of people there, but yeah.
Yeah, they're good folks there. Or if you want to go down the Seattle area, I would call up Kenmore or Glaziers and ask them who they have recommended down in the Seattle area.
Okay. Annette asks, how long should a camera last? Is there a limit to the number of images it can take before it wears out? And I think that would be kind of two-part if you're talking about an analog versus digital.
Yeah, the digital cameras, again, it depends upon the grade level. of it. If it's an entry-level camera, it's likely to have a shorter lifetime than, especially on the shutter. That's the real lifetime limitation. And I have a Nikon D500. I think its rated lifetime is 250,000 images or shutter clicks. I think the entry level may be like half of that or something, which is still a lot of clicks. That's a lot of clicks. So
I've got a Canon EOS entry level camera. I've had it 10 years. It's been all over the world. Never dropped it. Always keep it clean. And it's, as I say, this is 10 years old and it does everything I need it to do. You know, I'm not taking pictures, you know, at the level that Ham is, but for most of us, these kits are really good. And this one's a pretty easy one to use too. So,
what else we got, Drew?
There was an earlier question that I fielded a little bit, but would be interested if you have any other kind of recommendations of. I know we didn't want to get too much into specifics, but like iPhone adjustments and applications, like if you can adjust these settings on iPhone.
Yes, especially the latest iPhones, the latest Android phones have ability to get off of automatic mode and perform some of the functions in terms of focus, aperture, depth of field, shutter speed. So there is some manual capability. I've seen people take really excellent images with iPhones and other phones. However, my own personal preference, I find it to be clumsy for me to use. I grew up with the camera viewfinder in my eye, and I still prefer that. So, but you can get some very good images, and some of the recent ones have quite a bit of flexibility, as well as those preset modes, things of that nature. If you look at spending money, you might find that if you had to pay, the retail price for an iPhone, it might be substantially more expensive than a really good digital single lens reflex camera. So it depends. You always have the iPhone with you too.
right. Well, you can get a Canon or Nikon Olympia packages. Generally, Costco has them. Other places have them. If you really want to jump in, the entry level packages often come with 2 lenses for under $600, and you're going to spend more than that in a high end iPhone. You know.
Yeah.
And just from my personal experience, because I'm an iPhone user, I listed some apps in the chat, Halide and Focos. But then also I know I've done a lot of research with regard to like iPhone camera stuff since we've hit the pandemic, and there are like expansion lenses and stuff that you can actually click on to iPhone. So there's a whole suite of gear that allows you to do stuff like shoot entire Hollywood quality movies on iPhone.
Just depends on how much you want to spend.
I had a recommendation many years ago about automobiles, and it was actually from my father, and he was talking about sports cars or something like that. And I said, well, how do you know which car to buy? Okay, I was young and naive, still old and naive now. But, he said, well, sit in it, see how it feels. So the same thing goes with cameras, all right? Try one out, go down. You can actually rent cameras for short periods at a time, and lenses and so forth and so on from places like Borrow Lenses. Or you can go to a camera store when we are free of the pandemic kind of stuff, and try them out. Digital cameras, you can send there and take images in the store and see are the controls where you like them. There are different placements of controls on cameras and phones and so forth. My Android phone is different than your iPhone. Mm-hmm. And some may be ones that you feel very comfortable with. But the best thing to do is don't judge it, try it.
Yeah, there was a question about vibrations and reduction in the lenses, Ham.
Yes. Most of the lenses these days have some kind of vibration reduction. So what this does is they're basically little motors in the lenses or in the camera, depending upon the implementation. They're little motors that basically have devices that detect motion. And so what they'll do is they'll shift the image around or whatever, the parts around to compensate for that motion. And they do it very, very well. So if in days of old, you had to take a picture at 1/100th of a second, okay, in order to not have any camera shake. Today, you can take a picture maybe at 1/10th of a second. So it gives you a substantial additional shutter speed range without seeing any camera shake. And but almost all lenses now are coming out with some kind of vibration reduction. You would probably have to, if you're going into the market of buying used equipment, you would get back into the space where they didn't have vibration reduction.
Okay.
Yeah, and a
Yep.
lot of those older lenses aren't compatible with the newer bodies too, so you'd be running into all kinds of other challenges.
So,
Yep.
but hire a consultant or get to a salesperson, or whatever. Ask your friends who are photographers. Join a camera club here in Bellingham, or something like that. And there are lots of people around that are willing to share information and ideas.
So before we
And,
go,
yep, go ahead.
I was going to say, before we go, Ham and I are going to be doing more of this nature photography function with the Whatcom Land Trust this summer. We're going to start our first class sometime in May. And we'll all, of course, let the museum know we're happening, but we're actually going to be doing hands-on out in the field. We're going to be using Land Trust lands as our sites, and they'll be family focused. You could bring a family if you want, but you mostly you can make up a family, whatever it takes. But it'll be a family focused class, and it'll be happening for the Land Trust sometime in May. Now, that's.
And as the museum, we'll be trying to share those kinds of opportunities, because that sounds like a ton of fun when we can get back into, meeting in person again. So, and just to wrap things up, since we've hit our time, I want to thank Doug and Ham for being here or being virtual here and chatting and sharing these subjects with us. I want to thank our participants for being here. I also want to just mention, if you enjoyed this and you want to learn a little bit more, we're having some more webinar photography lessons throughout the month of March. We're actually having an artist, Jack Troutman, who has a photography exhibit at the museum, joining us next Saturday from 2 to 3 to talk about framing your photographs. And then the final little pitch there is that we're all leading up to, at the Whatcom Museum, this whole month of photography, we're doing a collaborative community exhibit about matriarchs. And so we're asking our community to contribute photos of matriarchs online, which then will assemble into a virtual exhibit. So more information about that can be found online and throughout more of these workshops. But we would love to see and to share some photographs from our community. So that's kind of one of the impetuses for all of these workshops. So thanks again to Ham and Doug. Thanks for everyone who attended and participated. And get out there and take some fun new photos.